project. It come in considerably cheaper, odds are it comes in more expensive when you start uncovering things as you remodel. But ballpark figures, those what we came up with working with maintenance and just common calculating things out.
Well, that's really nice and all, but you know, I've had this just a few minutes, and I wrote this big word here that says, where are you going to put them?
Well, this thought, when we talked to maintenance about what would be the easiest way to do this,
Yeah.
that would be remodeling this room, the
This
commissioner's
room here?
courtroom. Yeah, you'd split it basically in, you know, three. You'd have 2 offices in the back and an office in the front. You'd possibly pop the wall so you'd have a shared receptionist entry. And then you'd have your offices remain the same. Because we were trying to figure out what is the easiest way to do this,
And
you
the
know,
courtroom's
physically.
over in the Owen building, yeah?
Right. Yeah. Trying to figure out the easiest way to do this and to keep it in the courthouse. And that was kind of what we came up with.
Okay.
A lot of ways to do it, but that was the one that we felt would be the easiest given our existing layout.
All right.
And then I asked Mike to look into a little bit about potential offsets for the expense of the 5-person board and the administrator. And it's actually pretty interesting based on the compensation and using a $1,000 stipend about where we are in costs, relative costs. By utilizing this model, we'd come in at about $20,500 a month, and our current cost of county commissioners annualized is $21,979 a month. So we tried to look, and Mike, you can explain this a little bit about how the county relies on significant amount of grant and dedicated funding, which we can bill administrative costs to.
Well, nice of you to give me that topic, but clearly you're the expert on it. You're the one that pointed that out. Cam totally pointed out in many instances, the grants we submit have an administrative cost function to them. And we are probably underutilizing that function to be able to go on to a grant and say we need a certain percent for the administrative cost. The theory behind this is that when you have a county administrator, you can allocate all or a portion of that cost to the grants, which would get you additional grant money. And you know, we ran some projections in there, and be right up front. It's all very speculative. How much of the grants are available for administrative costs, and what percentage you can get. But you know, this extra money from the grants is probably on top of the savings you get from the current commissioner costs.
And we've talked about this quite a bit during the, I mean, at our staff meeting before last, we had a discussion about how we probably come in pretty low on administrative costing on grants because we haven't had an administrative cost study by department. So typically departments are going to put in less cost actually than what our true administrative cost is.
Well, and we also had that discussion in the budget process.
Yes.
And of course part of that comes back to get to the ability to be able to come to a cost of service and allocate overhead.
Yes.
So, you know, those are places we're going to have to go and do it. We've got a lot of work to do in that area, no matter what.
And this is going to require real, you know, roll up the sleeves, tear into our grants with our departments. But it's an exercise we have to do this year anyway, because we're basically, by not doing it, whether or not we get an administrator or we change governance, we're leaving money on the table. And even if we can just pick up 1% to 2% additional, that's a significant amount of money. And because we haven't done an administrative services cost study, we've been leaving that money on the table for quite a while in our true grant applications on both the state and the federal level. We've tried to get a little closer, thanks to Bob, but we need to do that same exercise across the board, regardless of whether or not this moves forward at the ballot.
Well, it is. We talked about this before. You know, trying to do exact costs. We can't actually make a profit by law.
No.
But doing actual costs and having a better cost breakdown of what services are actually being performed. And I guess my thought is we should have been doing this all along. Rather than, and even if we don't have this, if it doesn't pass, I think we need to have somebody deep dive into it, because a lot, I know it may work for some grants, but I think some grants are limited as to what you can charge administrative fee.
Some grants
And
are
they're
capped
off,
administrative
so
fees.
I don't know that this particular idea will apply to this administrator. Because of the capping of a lot of the grants we have, and the big ones we get are for law enforcement.
Mhm.
And they are specifically limited, as I believe, or we can ask the
Most
sheriff later on.
most grants are capped at some level, whether it's 5% or 8% or
if our costs are
13%.
8% and they're only paying 3,
Mhm.
you're out of luck with the extra 5.
Right.
So it doesn't go, those dollars don't go to the administrator to help offset the cost.
Well, what is completely legitimate in federal grants is to calculate your total administrative costs, your direct administrative costs, and then your actual applicable overhead. And say we hire an administrator, and that creates, another $170,000 cost across the departments. It would be reasonable to calculate what that cost is per department of the administrator's time, and then allocate that to the grant application. Say that 1% of the administrator's time is spent doing direct administration over that department. It's very applicable.
I don't know if you could apply that to like the CAFA grant in the assessor's office,
You
because it only has to be directly involved.
You'd probably have limitations on CAFA,
Yeah.
but on other funding, whether it's mental health, children and families, I mean, you probably do
Like the
have an
big-
upper limit.
What is it, we got the $600,000 grant for scent. The administrator wouldn't have any administrative authority over scent, it would be the sheriff.
Mhm. Well, that's why I say we'd have to work it out
and
by
in fact,
department.
talking about the assessor, it would be assessor, clerk, sheriff, DA, and surveyor would be all exempted from that, because the administrator by this doesn't have any authority over it.
Mhm.
And you notice in section 5 down there, we kind of took low, high. We have somewhere in the neighborhood of $14 million worth of grants, and in the first calculation, we said, let's assume only half of those have some ability to move that administrative charge, and let's say only move at 1%. And then we looked at the higher end and said, well, maybe it's as much as $10 million of those grants, maybe we can move it as much as 2%. So there's room to work in there. It may be, I think the assumption is it's going to be at least 70,000 we could bump out of there.
We-
Maybe more.
We tried to be really conservative on the low end on what we probably could, get the administrative bump out of in actual costs.
Well,
But-
let's take the mental health department, which has no elected official, and they exist slowly on grants, right? I would assume they're paying for the administrator, Ginger, through those administrative fees, not to add on an additional administrator on top of that.
But there's also additional true administrative costs that come from either the Board of Commissioners or HR or, County Council. I mean,
Well,
there
I
are.
think this thing, rather than throwing this out, needs a whole lot more study before you just throw out and say we're going to offset the cost of administrators through it.
No, we're not saying we're going to completely offset the cost of the administrator. We're saying that the potential's there to
Yeah.
offset some of the
Yeah, I
cost
got
of the
that part,
administrator
but-
by doing this. But the nice thing about it is,
May or may not do that.
even if we didn't do that, say we dump it and we don't do it, and say there's not a single grant that would allow us to increase by 1%. Given this model, we're still saving, I think it works out to $1,479 a month off our current expenditures
For what?
for having an administrator and having 5 commissioners.
Well, I'm
That's-
not so certain of that.
That's the difference. I mean, just in straight up front costs, that's what it is. If we do a stipend and we don't do any benefits, and we keep the administrator position basically at what Clatsop is, which is 170, inclusive of all benefits and PERS.
They're half our size, of course.
Mhm. But to use that as an example, that's probably the best example of an administrative model of what we're looking
How
at.
much does Jackson County pay? They're
don't
twice as
know.
big or 3 times as big as we are, or more. So we need a range in between.
Yeah, you need
someplace.
a median price, but even at that point, if we can say we can keep it, say we can hire a great administrator for a $170,000 package, and our commissioners are reimbursed on a $1,000 stipend, then you're going to save $1,479 a month. The interesting thing about that is that'll pay you back your one-time capital costs within 5 to 9 years, depending on how much you have to spend,
Yeah.
whether it's the low end or the high end.
Well, I was looking back here on item 4, you're talking about one-time expenses, but where's the ongoing monthlies?
Well, you probably have to figure in a certain amount of paper and pens
The
and
phone-
incidentals.
The phone bills and cell phone bills and that sort of stuff.
Mhm.
That's not in here.
We can calculate it in. Like I said, we did a real back of the envelope with as many actual costs as we could
Yeah.
figure.
Well, I think you can only do this on broad basis.
We can't get to the penny.
If you try to get down to the micro level on this, you're gonna go nuts, because everything you're talking about here is in the future. This whole thing, as we kind of touched on last meeting, is gonna evolve, number one, and it kind of comes down almost to a philosophical discussion.
No, not really. We're talking dollars here and expending the public's money. But I ran through this last, I guess it's the last page here, the monthly thing. I used the administrator cost, what you used, and then the 5 commissioner thing. I thought the administrative support was really light. I think it's more like 4,000 a month all told to have the support you're talking about with all the expenses. So I came up with $288,000 for an administrator and 5 commissioners and support.
We do pay 1 day a month for backup now. I mean, 1 day a week for backup with CARM, and we didn't factor that in at all, but that's a current amount that we already pay. We just listed it all as new dollars needed.
Adding that,
which gives you 32 hours plus, probably with the extra couple days of the
Then
month,
I-
about 36 already.
I kicked out the 5 commissioners at 1,000 a month. For the first 2 years, the commissioner fully paid. So I did administrator, administrative equipment and assistant. You got 256,000 plus 3 full-time commissioners at 264,000 roughly, for a grand total of about 520,000 for the first 2 years. This is just on the back of my hand here. I got it,
Your
quarter to 5 or something.
Your administrative cost is going to be whatever the cost of your administrator and his equipment is at the point that the board decides to hire him.
Yeah.
So
Which I assume is going to be after the first year sometime.
Well, I would think that if the
Probably
board
90
implements,
days after.
if the board implements an executive search and does what they're going to need to do
Yeah.
to find a really good person, you're probably looking at conservatively July 1st of next year to be able to
6
bring
months, okay.
yeah,
But we're still at
an administrator on.
450,000.
And you probably wouldn't need your full remodel at that point, because you're not bringing your other 2 commissioners on until the following.
Of course, if the
Year.
new commissioners decide not to have administrator in the first place, I guess it's all moot.
Well, that
Well,
could
they
be.
pay 'em- they pay
This,
the administrator
this
dollar.
creates, all this does is this, and correct me if I'm wrong, Josh, all this does is creates the position of administrator, correct?
That's right.
Yes.
They may not fund it. So, the other overlying question I got is, since all this stuff is not in the budget, where's the money coming from in the current budget?
Well,
There's no line items for this stuff.
well,
So-
and that's why I'm saying legitimately, I don't think, there's no way that you're gonna bring an administrator on short of July 1st of next year. So you're already a year out, and almost a year out in your funding cycle.
You've got to get ready for this person, so you're going to have some monies coming out of the budget, the 9,900 account, I guess, the unforeseen expenses. I don't know if this is unforeseen or not, but it's been looked at for a year now, but it's not there in the budget. So just curiosities about where it comes from the budget.
Well, if you're saying like if you buy the computer and the phone and
Well,
set them up.
You've got to have everything ready to go by July 1, right?
Mhm.
So you got offices, computers, extra staff, all this other stuff. It's not in the current budget. It would have to come out of the 9,900
Well,
account, which only has about 600,000 in it or so.
Yeah,
Well,
this-
but you're not gonna go to full funding in this budget cycle, anywhere close to.
No, and you're not gonna have to pay your staff until the following fiscal year. That's when you're gonna start paying additional staff. So really, all you'd be looking at is whatever it would take to set them up, to
That's
start
what I'm
them
saying,
with
all
a
the setup.
desk and the phones, and we've got
Offices,
enough
that sort of
desks,
stuff.
actually, we do have desks, thank goodness.
You know, offices, that sort of thing, and remodeling.
Yeah.
It's not gonna be cheap. It
Yeah.
has to come from somewhere.
But you wouldn't have to go full remodeling in this budget cycle. You wouldn't have to pull that out of any of the budget cycle, you know, to knock out walls and do all that, because that really wouldn't even be necessary until you were ready to bring the
You're
two,
at- and you're actually 2 years down.
the two commissioners on. I mean, we certainly could find space for a county administrator and additional phone lines and desk, and without having to do a full board remodel.
And secretary.
Yeah, part-time
Part-time,
secretary,
yeah.
yeah. Because
So-
that's based strictly on the biggest time drag on
But-
Bobby's time is minutes. Transcription takes a tremendous amount of time. So that's why, I know Mike had the chance to talk to her, and I talked to her too, and that would be the biggest level of support that she would need, is to not have to do the minutes anymore, because that would enable her to serve an administrator and 5 commissioners then.
And she's already putting in far more than she gets paid for in
Right.
hours.
And so
By the
that
way.
that was why we had a very frank discussion about what would make her life better so she could accommodate this sort of change.
Okay. We got anything else we wanna cover on?
Other than public comment, maybe.
Yeah, just other, I mean, if you guys don't
Well-
have any other language changes that you'd like to see, you know, by tomorrow morning.
I think
I
we've done
think we need a lot of work on this proposed cost, but.
Well,
I
the
don't
cost,
really agree with.
the cost won't go into the ordinance. This is just.
Yeah, I know, but, you know,
Probably pay
when I
appreciated
vote on
value.
something, I wanna know what it's gonna cost me.
Yeah, put that in the
You know, if we're funding a sheriff's levy, they tell us how much per thousand it's gonna cost us. And
Hmm.
you can decide whether you're gonna pay for it or not, and vote, you know, respectively. I don't know how much is this gonna cost me in the proposal to the public. Do they vote for it? No. My sense is, I wouldn't personally vote without knowing what it's gonna cost me.
Well, we certainly can do a very detailed fiscal analysis in the next few
Not-
weeks if
not
that's
then.
needed, but you.
Not by tomorrow night.
But not by tomorrow night, but I don't think there's a need to do that, because we're gonna have, if we decide to put this on the ballot, we're gonna have months to discuss it.
Well, that will be part of the process she'll go through in the ballot process. But as far as the discussion that will happen over that time, will bring it, or that debate will bring out
Well,
that aspect of it.
like Mike and I talked about this a lot, and the absolute best we can do is try and list well, like you did, Bob, and going through, is try and list everything we could think of that we'd incur as a cost, and take our best shot at what the potential cost is gonna be, because if you're not fully implementing for 2 years, as you know, Bob, look at how our contracts changed just in 3 months. You could have differences in the cost estimates. So the best we could do is a relative cost estimate of what we think the potential costs are
Yeah,
gonna
what
be.
I discussed here was roughly what 10 minutes I had running through it and running my little handy dandy calculator.
But the other thing that we gotta realize is this transition is not gonna be a zero-sum game.
No.
It's gonna take some funding to be able to finance the transition. But if we look at what our expectation and what others that have done this as an experience is that there's certainly low-hanging fruit that will come forward to be able to finance that.
What would
As
that be
Just the efficiencies that you can gain
from?
realigning your administrative functions, and, you know, you're basically gonna be looking at how your functions interact through the whole system. Well, for instance, if you go through and streamline your AP, accounts payable, your payroll system, where you take the redundancy out of it, you would expect to be able to gain efficiencies in that you could use those resources elsewhere. at this point in time, don't look, I guess, horizontal, particularly. It's by department, and not whether they're, you know, there's a lot of shared functions that could have some real benefit. It's very difficult to manage without being able to get that vertical integration to it.
I mean, you've given me kind of a general example, but I mean, looking at this county and what's going on, can you define, accounts payable issue, are one that you can't just solve yourself, you need someone else to solve?
You've got to do it on a system-wide basis. Frankly, at this point in time, we don't have an integrated accounting system that will handle it.
So why
We're in the process. We're looking at
I think regardless of whether Coos County votes for an administrator or not, there's going to be some pretty significant administrative changes in the next year. And we're working towards consolidation of departments now for economies and efficiencies, and I think it's just kind of part of a bigger picture. You know, one of the most simple things, I mean, just if you take the most base simple thing, is for a department head not to have to go to 3 different commissioners and explain exactly the same thing each time and bring the paperwork and go over it, and just the amount of time that takes. That's a real simple savings.
Why do they have to do that? Don't they just do that when they're presenting to you?
Well, they typically will FYI us on the meetings they attend, on what's going on at the state level, so we're kept in the loop. I mean, that's
Isn't that a common administrative managerial function?
Yes.
I FYI my partners all the time.
But it takes time. And the difference is you're only FYIing and sitting down with an administrator versus having to individually sit down with each one of the board members to relay the same exact information.
Why do they have to sit down with you? Why do they have to sit down with you now? I mean, they FYI you and then they present to the DOC.
Because if they didn't explain a lot of the changes that are coming down, I mean, they go through, just in mental health services and public health services alone, the massive, dramatic amount of changes that are coming down and how we're going to adapt to that. They have to go page by page to work through that. I mean, it's incredibly involved. And to keep us in the loop and to keep us up to speed, they do have to sit down with us, because you couldn't write a long enough email.
Okay. Do we want to kind of run the table here with some public comment?
Sure.